Thank you, Charmaine. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to this shareholder open house meeting. As Charmaine says, it's great to see both some familiar faces and some new faces here. And just a word on format before we get stuck in. I'm going to talk for about 20 or 30 minutes and run through the company presentation here. This is non-confidential. It's available on our website. It's easy to access, so don't feel like you've got to take notes. But after we finish the presentation, I'd be really happy to address some questions. We've had a couple of people email in over the last few days, so if we get some time, we might try and address those questions as well. And then we'll adjourn to the back of the room and enjoy some canapes and a glass of wine and chat more informally. So really pleased to be talking it all through with you today. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I guess if there's a key message that I really want to share today, it is that Percheron is back in business. And we're back in a slightly different form than before. Our sense of purpose has broadened. We are now both an oncology and rare diseases company. And oncology, by virtue of the asset that we've licensed in the last couple of weeks, HMBD-002. And so most of what I'm going to talk about today is this new program, which we are tremendously excited about. But one key thing that I think, in a way, hasn't changed is that we are now once again a mid-clinical stage biotech company. There's a good reason why this is the first bullet point in our corporate deck, and it's because we recognize that the whole process of drug development end-to-end is an enormously protracted one. And one of the things that the board was very, very determined as it became clear the company would need to regenerate itself was that we could not take shareholders right back to square one and start fresh. So the transaction that we've recently announced allows us to jump back in really not very far from where we were back in December. It gives us a phase 2 ready molecule now to take forward into mid-stage clinical trials. And that is important because that's really where the interesting stuff happens. That's where drugs in development build value, and that's really where things get interesting for shareholders in a public company. So we're very, very pleased with the transaction that we've done because it's been able to solve that crucial requirement. More broadly, we actually think that we've found a wonderful asset around which to rebuild our company. And you can see here some of the things that really drew us to this asset. Out of the more than 100 drug opportunities that we looked at over the last 6 months. And in a way, this really constitutes, if you like, the investment thesis for Percheron as it now stands. And so, as you can see on the left, there's a lot to be said about the scientific merits of 002. This is a drug that stands at the sweet spot between very, very novel cutting-edge science, but at the same time a very, very well-validated and well-understood mechanism of action. And that's really where we most wanted the company to be doing something that's right out on the frontier, but at the same time is not purely speculative. It's not a science project. This is well-understood science. We are in possession of a very nicely differentiated asset. You know, there are other people focused on this target, and there always are in drug development. If you ever see a company that has an asset that nobody else is working in a similar space, it's usually a pretty discouraging sign. But we think that the drug we now have, 002, is really nicely separated from the rest of the field here. It has what we call in the industry best-in-class potential. And that's something that really excited us about this drug. And then as we'll touch on, this is a drug that has already completed a substantial part of its development. This drug has been in development for approximately 7 years. It's had some tens of millions of dollars spent on its development to date. And that means that we've really skipped many of the early steps in the drug development process. As I say, we stand now ready to move this drug into phase 2 human trials. And for reasons we'll come to later in the presentation, that is really where a public company needs to be. And then as you can see here, we think this drug also has enormous commercial potential. This is a very, very partnerable field with very real commercial opportunity attached to it. So let me jump ahead a little bit, and I'm I'm going to jump straight into a little bit of science here, and I apologize in advance for this, but I think it helps to understand what we're talking about, to just spend a few minutes talking a little bit about this drug and how it works. And to do that, we need to start by recognizing that one of the most important recognitions of the last 25 years has been the understanding of the role that the immune system plays in cancer. And this, in fact, was the basis of the 2018 Nobel Prize for Medicine. You know, that this has been really one of the most significant advances in the treatment of cancer of the 21st century. And to put it very simply, for cancer to occur, it needs to evade the immune system. We, all of us, have, if you like, precancerous cells being developed in our body all the time. I live in Queensland most of the time. I go to the beach at the weekend. I get blasted by ultraviolet light, and some of the cells in my skin probably get damaged by that. I might go home and have a beer, and some of the cells in my liver might be damaged by that. And then I have a steak for dinner, and that in turn can damage the lining of my colon. The reason all those things don't turn into cancer is partly because of my immune system. Just as our immune system protects us from infections, from bacteria and viruses and so forth, it protects us from these very, very early precancerous cells. So for a tumor to establish itself in the body, it needs to turn off the immune system around it. It needs to suppress the immune system. And we've recognized this for a long time, but we've only really in the last couple of decades started to understand how. And the left-hand part of this slide shows some of how it does this. The tumor cell is covered in little appendages, little protein appendages, which interact with similar protein appendages on immune system cells, and by doing so, switch off those cells. So the tumor effectively switches off all the immune system cells around it. And this is necessary for the tumor to establish in the body. And there's a long list of these interactions, these little protein-to-protein interactions. There's probably about 20 or more of these that have been characterized. And we've just shown 4 of them here for simplicity. But they're 4 of the more interesting ones. The top 2 there, the interaction between CTLA-4 and various counterparts, is the basis of an approved drug called Yervoy. And then the one below that, the interaction between PD-1 and PD-L1, has been the basis of a number of approved drugs, of which Keytruda, you see there, is itself just alone about a $30 billion a year commercial product. So far, we've succeeded globally as an industry in developing drugs that target 2 of these interactions. And there are a few others, but they target these same interactions, CTLA-4, PD-1, PD-L1. But what everybody is waiting for now is the next generation of so-called immuno-oncology drugs that will target some of these other signaling interactions. And you can see 2 here that I've singled out. Now, the LAG-3 one is interesting because there is actually another Australian company developing a drug against that, a company called Immutep, ticker IMM, has got a drug called eftilagimod alpha, and that targets LAG-3. That drug's still in development. They're probably about maybe 18 months ahead of us, but it gives us a really interesting comp, actually quite a like-for-like peer comparison to what Percheron will hopefully grow into. And then down at the bottom, you can see VISTA. Stands for V-domain immunoglobulin suppressor of T-cell activation. So for the rest of the day, I'm going to call it VISTA. And that is the target of our drug. That's the target of 002. That is now the space that we're operating in. So as you can see, we're really trying to develop a drug against VISTA that will put us in the same neighborhood as some of these successful products like Keytruda and Opdivo and Tecentriq and Libtayo and Yervoy and so forth. And this, just to stress the point, this is an enormous commercial market. So just the 4 drugs you see there, the 4 approved drugs, represent over $40 billion of global sales per annum. And as I say, there are other drugs behind these as well. So this is really one of the most substantial and fast-growing areas in the global oncology marketplace. Now, why do we think VISTA might be an attractive target for a drug? Well, first of all, we find VISTA on many, many different types of cancer. So as you can see from the left-hand panel there, this is a drug that crops up in cancer of the pancreas, and cancer of the bowel, ovarian cancer, you name it. Most cancers express a significant amount of VISTA. Just to manage expectations, this alone will not be the basis on which we choose indications. There are other parameters that come into how we think about developing this drug. But it certainly gives us a huge smorgasbord of different cancer types where this drug could be very relevant. And we know, as you can see in the middle panel, that VISTA is relevant to the outcome of cancer. Because we see, for example, here in this set of 85 melanoma patients, those that have a lot of VISTA do much worse than those that don't have very much VISTA. So the implication is if we can shut off VISTA, if we can damp it down as our drug aims to do, that should hopefully improve the prognosis for patients with cancer. And there's a range of this similar data in other forms of cancer as well. And then perhaps most interestingly, on the right-hand side here, you can see that VISTA is probably part of how cancers become resistant to existing drugs. So this PD-1 is the target of Keytruda, among others, the drug that I just touched on, $30 billion a year in sales, approved for more than a dozen different cancer types. If you have a lot of VISTA in your cancer, it is much more likely to be resistant to Keytruda. And if you don't have very high VISTA, then it may respond better to Keytruda. And so that opens up the very, very real possibility that our drug could significantly enhance the effect of drugs like Keytruda. And this is important because although these drugs have been very successful and they've really revolutionized the treatment of many cancers, they don't work for every patient. In fact, Keytruda on average works for perhaps about a third of patients. And ultimately, most of those patients do become resistant in time. So if our drug is able to overcome that resistance, even to a limited extent, that would be an enormous step forward in the treatment of this disease. So let me jump ahead here. Before we get into just sharing some of the specific data about 002, I just want to give you a sense of where this is in development. I think one of the things we recognize is that the drug development process, we all have different levels of familiarity with it. And I touched on the fact at the beginning of the presentation that this drug is well advanced. This is not right back at square one. So on the top left of the slide, you can see here what we call preclinical development. This is all the work that has to go on really before a drug gets into human trials. And that work has been substantially done. We may need to do a little bit more work somewhere along the way before an NDA, that is a new drug application, that is application for permission to sell the drug. But if we do, we think that should occur in parallel to the human trials. For those who've been with the company for a long time, you may recall that this was a bit of a rate-limiting step for our previous drug. And the nice thing is that for this drug, that work has substantially been done. There is an open IND. We're already there. Just briefly switching to the bottom, the manufacturing work, the purple part of this slide. Again, people who've been in a number of biotech companies will be familiar that, particularly for drugs of this type, manufacturing is often one of the most challenging parts of the process. These drugs can be very, very technically difficult to make. And again, the great news is that work has been done. Our licensor has developed actually a very, very efficient and very reliable manufacturing process. They've manufactured multiple batches of the drug already. The FDA has given their seal of approval to that work. So again, there'll be some fine-tuning and some tweaking, as there always is for any drug at this stage in development, but fundamentally, we know how to make this. And so finally, that leaves us with clinical trials, the top right part of this slide. And this drug has already completed phase 1. Now that is always primarily a safety study, but as we'll come to in a moment, the results that have come out of that are tremendously positive, tremendously encouraging. So to cut a long story short, whenever you're developing any new drug, there are fundamentally 3 things that you need to satisfy regulatory agencies like FDA about. You need to be able to show that it's safe. You need to be able to show that it works. And in cancer, it's often enough to just show that it works a little bit, to be very clear. And you need to be able to show that you can make it. And two of those questions, in effect, have already been answered for us. We know we can make it. We really are very confident the drug is extremely safe. So the task now for us is to complete the third element of this puzzle and show that it's efficacious. So we're 2/3 of the way down the journey. Let's just look a little bit at some of this data. So I said already that our licensor had done a lot of preclinical work to really understand the efficacy of the drug, really kind of substantiate that. This is a little snapshot of this. There's a great deal more, and we're working now to try and find ways that we can kind of get this into the public domain so that people can appreciate it. But this gives you a flavor of some of the data that's out there. And you can see on the left, the three charts show multiple different cancer models, colon cancer and mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the lining of the chest. And in each case, the pink line shows 002, our drug. The red line shows a control group that doesn't get the drug. And lower is better here. The lower the line, the better the drug is working. And as you can see, we get between about 40 and 80% suppression of tumor growth. Now, just to be clear, a drug working in a mouse model does not guarantee that it's going to work in people. But if a drug doesn't work in a mouse model, it's pretty clear that it's not going to work in humans. So this is really positive data. This is really encouraging, and it gives us a good sense that our drug is working across multiple animal models. And then on the right-hand side here, you can see some data in combination with pembrolizumab, Keytruda, the drug I just mentioned. Again, the black line is just the tumor by itself. It's the control group. The green line is pembrolizumab, and you can see just the two drugs by themselves, 002 is working very slightly better. But when you give them in combination, which is the blue line, it is devastatingly efficacious. It is just shutting that tumor down almost completely. So again, this really gives us very useful information to think about as we think about how to move this drug forward into through human trials. It gives us the sense of the fact that the drug is broadly active across a range of different tumor types, but it also makes us really interested in this possibility of combination use. Let's talk about the phase 1 data just for a moment. And this was a really nice high quality study, 48 patients, so a really decent size. And the way these studies typically work is they start off with a very low dose of the drug, just a homeopathic dose of drug. See how patients respond, see how the safety profile looks. If it's tolerated okay, they increase the dose, and if that's tolerated okay, they increase it again, and so on, until they encounter unacceptable toxicity. So sometimes we find a drug makes patients nauseous, or sometimes it changes some of their blood work. You know, the toxicities vary from drug to drug. But generally, we try and keep escalating the dose until we start to encounter toxicity. This study didn't get there because they saw so little toxicity that they didn't find what we call a maximum tolerated dose. The top few cohorts there are already in what we would consider to be an effective dose, that's a dose that should be working. So they concluded that actually this drug was so safe that there's no point carrying on forever, so they stopped after these 7 dose levels with an incredibly favorable safety profile. They then went on and actually combined it in humans, in patients, with pembrolizumab, with Keytruda, the drug that I mentioned earlier, which are the orange boxes there. And to cut a long story short, it was no more toxic in combination than it was by itself. So what this gives us is a really strong sense that we've got a very safe drug on our hands, and a drug that can be safely combined with Keytruda, as I say, the most commonly prescribed immuno-oncology therapy. And that's really good data to be going into phase 2 with. And I should say, this study was conducted in the United States under the oversight of the FDA at some absolutely blue ribbon cancer centers. Some of the names you see on the right side of the slide there, centers like Cedars-Sinai, MD Anderson, Miller Cancer Center at Yale. These are really the creme de la creme of cancer centers. They're maybe not everyday names for us here, but in the field, these are recognized as some of the top cancer centers in the world. So it gives us a body of clinicians now with enormous credibility and enormous networks behind them who have tried our drug and who have firsthand experience of using it. I won't labor the detail too much here, but as you can see from the chart on the left, the dark blue shows what we call serious treatment-related adverse events. And these were really, and as you can see, it's just a handful of patients in each group. It's not more in the combination group than it is in the monotherapy group. And to be honest, although these are considered treatment-related, sometimes we don't really know. A lot of the toxicities we saw with this drug were things like nausea and fatigue. And in a study like this, that can be very difficult to interpret because the fact is cancer can make you feel quite nauseous, and it certainly makes you feel very, very tired. So those kinds of effects in a study like this, we don't make much of. But we didn't see any liver toxicity. We didn't really see any of the other things that would make us concerned for a drug at this stage in development. Now, the way these studies are almost always done is that they're what we call all-comer studies. They bring in patients with a wide variety of cancers, and almost all of these patients are very, very end stage. They've all been through multiple lines of treatment. They've, in many cases, had 4, 5, 6 previous therapies. So sad to say, these patients are nearing the end of the road. And that can make it complex to interpret the efficacy data here. But you see on the left here a breakdown of the patients we got in the monotherapy group, some pancreatic cancer, some bowel cancer, some breast cancer, and so on. And then the combination group, actually about half the patients with breast cancer, some with lung cancer, and so on. And although these are really not much more than anecdotes at this stage, we did see some of these patients that really spent quite a long time on drug with very stable disease, which is not what we expect for patients at this stage. So although it's anecdotal data, it's circumstantial at this stage, it gives us a really, really good feel that our drug is doing something. It gives us a sense that the drug is moving the needle for at least some of these patients. Now, this is no substitute for a proper prospective clinical trial. As one of my old bosses used to say, the plural of anecdote is not data. These instances don't represent a substitute for a proper clinical trial, but it certainly gives us a flavor that something is happening here, and that's really encouraging. So as we're picking through this data, we're thinking now about what does this tell us about how we take this drug forward. And so as we think about that, there's a few options available to us. Now, one is to take it forward as a monotherapy. In other words, take the drug forward by itself. And certainly if you look at that animal data that I showed you a little while ago, and if you even look at some of the cases in the phase 1 study, it would certainly make you feel very, very optimistic about taking this drug forward just as a monotherapy all by itself. And we may well do that. But we're also really intrigued by this idea of combination use. And I think at some stage we will be exploring this, whether it's the immediate next thing we do or it's something that happens a little bit further down the line. I think the ability to combine this drug with existing immunotherapy is perhaps one of the most interesting things about it. And as I say, it's frankly an opportunity to ride on the coattails of some very, very successful pharmaceutical products. And so I think this is something we're thinking through carefully as well. But because the drug is so safe, I think there's also opportunities to combine it with other kinds of drugs. We mentioned EGFR inhibitors there, but even things like radiotherapy. So we're going to be thinking about all these things over the next month or two. We do want to take the advice of some clinicians as we think this through. I think these are not decisions to be taken lightly. So we want to make these decisions carefully rather than hurriedly. But it's wonderful to be in a position to have such a range of possibility in front of you. This will be a phase 2 study. And most people in the room will be aware that there are classically 3 phases of human trials for a drug. Phase 1, where we're all about safety. Phase 2, where we're looking to understand potential efficacy. And then phase 3 are usually the large confirmatory trials that are required. In cancer, this often works a bit differently because quite often FDA will consider approving a drug after a phase 2 trial, something they call accelerated approval. And it really recognizes the fact that for many patients dealing with a diagnosis of cancer, there are so few treatment options available that it's better to get something fast than to spend years in development. So in cancer, phase 2 studies are sometimes registration studies, and we'll be looking to try and maximize that possibility as we go through the clinical program. So this is a big part of what we're thinking about at the moment. And I just really want to make 2 more points, and then we'll close and be really, really happy to take some questions. But I want to talk, first of all, about the competitive landscape for this drug. I mentioned at the beginning that any biological target that only has one company in the world developing a drug against it, there's probably a reason why there's only one company in the world. And sure enough, Vista, the target of this drug, has at least half a dozen drugs that we're aware of, and probably a few more that we have yet to come across. And you can see some of them outlined here. Now, there's a crucial difference between our drug and just about every other drug that's out there. And the difference lies in that second line you see there, the isotype of the antibody. And again, I don't want to bore you with a lot of science here, but antibodies come in different flavors. Almost all of the drugs that have been developed against Vista so far are what we call an IgG1 antibody. Now, the problem with an IgG1 antibody is that they are very immunostimulatory. They switch on your immune system in a big way. And so for drugs targeting Vista that are IgG1, they have caused a lot of toxicity. They cause a particular phenomenon called cytokine release syndrome, which is overactivity of the immune system. So several of these drugs have been terminated, we believe on grounds of safety, we believe due to cytokine release syndrome, and it's because they are IgG1 antibodies. Our antibody is IgG4. And that means that it doesn't switch on the immune system quite so aggressively. And in the 48 patients who have taken this drug so far, we have seen no sign at all of cytokine release syndrome. So it looks like we have a drug that, if nothing else, has a very, very compelling safety differentiation from just about every drug out there. And this is something that really, really drew us to it. You can also see that it is arguably the most advanced drug in clinical development, 48 patients dosed to date, which is the largest clinical experience of any drug in this class. But I think this IgG4 isotype is going to be an absolutely critical thing that differentiates this drug from any of the competing products out there. So finally then, what does this mean about what the drug may be worth in the future? And I should say that for little companies like Percheron, usually our aspiration is to build value around the drug, but then to partner it with a larger company for commercialization. And I think that's our default approach here. I think that's our expectation for 002. And so we've shown here some benchmarks for what they're worth of loosely similar deals for drugs like this. Now, just to be clear, individual mileage may vary. Every drug is different. Every deal is different. But as you can see on the top part of the slide there, early to mid-clinical, you can see a number of loosely comparable deals. CTLA-4 was one of the targets we spoke about a few minutes ago. And I think one of the things that comes through there is we actually got this drug pretty cheap. So, you know, we're already got a drug that probably is worth more than we've paid for it. But what we really want to do is move it into the lower part of this table, the late clinical drugs. So the drugs here you can see that are entering phase 3 or are in phase 3. And you can see here some very, very different kinds of numbers on the right-hand side. And that's because a phase 2 trial, what we call in the industry a proof of concept trial, that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of the valuation of a new drug. A drug, particularly in cancer, that has shown clinical proof of concept, that has shown itself to be efficacious in human trials, that's where we see this huge quantum leap in terms of valuation. So if you like, the business model for Percheron going forward, at least in respect of 002, is to move this drug from the top of this slide to the bottom. And that's going to be the work for us over the next couple of years. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I'm going to stop and I'd be really happy to address your questions. Brian.
I read where back in 2021, Hummingbird had a collaboration with Merck.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that and what happened there and where's Merck today?
Yes, so it was the study I just showed you. So I mentioned that in their phase 1 study, they tried the drug by itself, which was the blue boxes on the slide. But they also tried it in combination with Keytruda, also called pembrolizumab. That's a Merck drug, and so they had to get the drug from Merck. And so that was really the thrust of the collaboration with Merck, was this phase 1 study, and Merck's contribution was, among other things, to provide the drug for combination use. The really nice thing is it means that this drug is now on the radar of the largest company in the immuno-oncology field. So it's a relationship we will be trying to pick up and carry forward. But that was the thrust of that collaboration. Yeah, Paul, I think that's right. And by the way, I'll just repeat the questions here so we capture them for the recording. So the question was really all about Merck's potential interest in a drug like this and its combination with Keytruda. And look, absolutely. Just to be very transparent with everybody, there are a number of drugs in development for cancer that are targeting all kinds of other immuno-oncology drugs. Capturing Merck's attention right now is a little bit the holy grail of immuno-oncology drug development. So it's us and some number of other companies that are banging on their door. But the fact that they have already been involved in a trial with this drug, they've already provided Keytruda, they're already got it on the radar, I think is a huge flying start. And so again, just for the recording, the question was why didn't Merck just pick this up in early development? Look, sometimes they do, but if I jump ahead to this slide, the reality for all big pharma companies these days is that they are extremely cash rich, but they are also extremely risk intolerant. So they would much prefer, and I've had this conversation many times with many big pharma companies, they would much prefer to pick up a drug at the bottom of this slide where most of the risk has been taken out of it rather than at the top of the slide. And I've had the conversation before with many companies, and I say, you realize you're going to be paying us $250 million just in the upfront if this drug is successful. I say, that's fine, no problem. But we don't want to take it in and then incur the risk of it failing. So realistically, I think this drug becomes most valuable to big pharma companies once we have this clinical proof of concept. That is such a major de-risking step. I mentioned earlier, there are really 3 things that we need to show for a drug. We need to show we can make it, we need to show it's safe, and we need to show it can work. We are 2/3 of the way there, but that third element, showing that it works, is really the thing that takes it into orbit in terms of valuation. But this drug is on the radar. And one of the nice things, as part of our diligence, as part of looking into this drug as we were considering it is we do a very, very careful scan of all the scientific literature, and partly to understand the data that's out there, but also partly to understand the buzz, to understand people talking about this. And it was good. There's a lot of conferences, a lot of scientific review papers and things like that that are talking about this drug. So this is on watch lists. There's no question about it. So the question here was really, can we provide more color about a phase 2 study? When's it going to start? How big is it going to be? How long is it going to take? Some of these questions, in all honesty, are really difficult to answer just yet because we are still doing the work of thinking through where exactly do we want to position this. Do we take this into breast cancer, or do we take it into lung cancer? Do we take it forward by itself? Do we take it forward in combination? All these kind of things are questions that require a bit of work to answer. And one of the things we want to do is get some advisory boards of oncologists together to really talk it through. So right now, to be honest, we can't We can't give you a straight answer to all those questions because we need to do that work. And although it's a bit tortuous, it's important that we get it right. We don't want to set this drug on the wrong path. We want to make sure we set this up for success. But, and in terms of when a study starts, look, for the moment, we're going to keep it reasonably broad. But look, obviously, the sooner we can get it back into the clinic, the better. We're working to make that as quickly as possible. We do need to probably do a bit more manufacturing. We need to make a bit more of the drug. We have got some ready-made as part of the deal. We've got some more coming as part of the deal. So there shouldn't be any real material cost associated with that, but it'll be, some months before we have all the drug supply that we would like. So over the next couple of months, let's see how all these things converge. And as soon as we can kind of say to people, look, we're aiming to start here, we'll share a bit more detail. But right now, I think it'd probably be premature. To give you a very, very general sense, though, of what a phase 2 oncology study looks like, look, honestly, how long is a piece of string, right? They can be almost anything. But these are usually tens of patients rather than hundreds of patients. If we're doing studies in diabetes, for example, an entry-level study in diabetes is many, many hundreds, if not thousands of patients. Even in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, certainly a decent phase 3 study in Alzheimer's would be 4,000 patients, and at a cost of about $400 million. And you need 2 of them, by the way. We're at the exact opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the size and the complexity and the duration of our studies. So, I think we should expect here a study that is in, let's say, dozens of patients, to avoid the tens word, and perhaps somewhere between sort of 18 and 30 months in duration as a ballpark. So, but we've got some work to do. But as soon as we've got a very, very clear sense of direction on this, I promise you we'll be out there kind of sharing it with people and providing more details. So you'll be hearing more from us over the next couple of months about what this looks like. So the question again was, what resources do the company have to do this work? And we have cut this company absolutely to the bone over the last 6 months. We had to. It's the right thing to do, but it's been one of the tough elements of the last 6 months. We will probably need a couple of extra people over the next few months. So you might start to see some new faces around the shop, but it's going to be 2 or 3 people rather than 20 or 30 people. I think we want to keep the business ultra lean. As you say, Brian, there's an enormous amount we can do by outsourcing. We can, we can, and there's a lot we can do in collaboration with clinicians. We can really get them to help us out a lot here. So we have no desire to build a business of 50, 70, 100 people. I think that is not the right answer for Percheron anytime in the foreseeable future. We will remain an extremely lean company. And I think we're strong believers that with a few very experienced people, you can do the work of a very large number of less experienced people. And that's really been something, the ethos of the company over the last couple of years. No, it's a great question. So the question was, back in I think about February, we spoke a little bit about an opportunity we were looking at that stage in neurological disease. And cut a long story short, we're still in discussion with that company. I will be honest and say it's been moving pretty slowly. Back in February, when we started talking about it, it was probably our most favored opportunity. This opportunity really came on our radar in about March, and we immediately sort of shifted gears a little bit because we thought this was much better. Don't get me wrong, the neurological opportunity is very promising, but it was earlier stage. It had not yet been in any patients. It was what you might call phase 1 ready. And frankly, it was a more focused opportunity, a narrower opportunity than this. So as soon as we saw this, we thought, well, goodness, this is a much better opportunity to rebuild our company. So I'd say somewhere around about March, April, we really shifted gears. Now, we are still in discussion with that company about the neurological opportunity, and indeed with a number of other companies. We've spoken to dozens of companies over recent months. Long term, I actually think the right answer for the company is to have more than one thing in its pipeline. I think, we've all learned a hard lesson over the last 6 or 9 months about all or nothing risk. in drug development. And I think one of the discussions we have regularly at the board level is about, well, how do we insulate shareholders from that binary risk profile? How do we spread our bets? How do we give ourselves more shots on goal? So I think in the medium term, let's say, whatever that might mean, we aspire to have something additional in the company's pipeline. Now, it's got to be as good as the asset we've got, which sets a very, very high bar. And it's got to make sense, and it's got to be something we can bring in that doesn't create an enormous capital requirement for the company. I think we really need to manage that consideration very carefully. But if we find the right asset, whether it's this particular one or whether it's something else, then I think that remains very much part of the aspiration for Percheron. So look, watch this space. But we're still, we're still talking to a number of these companies. Some of them we'd rather just wait and see how they go for a little while. But we're keeping our options open. Yeah, Greg, absolutely. So the question was about capital raising intentions. And look, I think the most useful thing I can say right now is no near-term plans. We'll have, obviously, our June quarter quarterlies go out by the end of this month, and that'll give you a sense of our cash position. But, we had $12.9 million at bank at the end of March. We were pretty transparent about what the residual liabilities associated with the previous program were. Broadly speaking, there were a couple of million still to go at that stage. So you can do the math and work out roughly where we end up as at the end of June. As we've disclosed, we paid a $3 million US up front. So we've also got an R&D tax rebate that we should get in the second half of the year. So look, we're going to end up with some millions of dollars as a war chest to develop this drug. And there's a lot you can do with that money. And the nice thing about oncology drug development is that sometimes it can be done a little bit more economically than in a field like Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we actually have some cash at the bank right now. We have some firepower to do the work we need to do for at least the immediate future. Now, obviously, we see where our plans take us and where our discussions take us, but right now, we're okay. We've got some money at the bank, and we're in the fortunate position that we can get on and do some drug development rather than worrying too much about capital. Greg, so again, the question was really how the economics of a partnering deal work if the work is done in a collaboration. The honest answer is it depends so much on the structure of the collaboration. Sometimes companies will give you their drug to try almost for free. Sometimes they'll charge you a little bit of money for it. Sometimes they'll take a very small royalty on sales if the drug is successful. Sometimes there's a few milestone payments based on success. It really varies so much and it depends a little bit who does most of the work, frankly. So, but I certainly, the scenario you described where the companies sort of share equally in the profits, I would say almost as the exception rather than the rule. I think in most of the scenarios that we would envisage, the lion's share of the economic value will accrue to Percheron. That's usually the way things go. Paul, we absolutely have, and the question again was really about pancreatic cancer as a target indication. And look, it's a great thought, and it is very much on the radar screen. Certainly, there's some really good rationale to think about that cancer. The one thing I would say that slightly goes against pancreatic cancer is that it has a bit of a reputation as what's sometimes referred to in the industry as a graveyard indication. I don't really like using that kind of language, but it's probably pancreatic and brain cancer is the other sort of graveyard indication where many drugs have been tried and very, very few have shown much success. So as we think about what is the story that's going to attract investors back into our company, what's going to give people the most confidence to return to Percheron, we need to just tread carefully that we don't straight out of the gate pick something that's seen as being a very, very high bar to clear. Now, Having said that, I mean, the unmet need in pancreatic cancer is so high. And there's such strong patient advocacy. For example, here in Australia, we've got, I think it's Pankind, the advocacy group, which I think is right here in Melbourne. So, you know, I think we would have enormous support if we went there, but at the same time, we want to make sure that wherever we go, particularly first, is where we've got the most chance of success. And so it's just balancing all those considerations. Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. So the question was about our licensor, Hummingbird Bioscience, and how much they spent on the drug to date, and why are they not developing them themselves if it's so great. Maybe I'll try and just answer the sort of parts of those questions in sequence. So Hummingbird's about a 10-year-old company. It's a private company. They're backed by some of the top venture capital firms in the life sciences sector, groups like Novo Ventures, Frazier Partners, Cheng Capital. They've raised, I think, about $300 or $400 million to date. So they've been incredibly successful, and those are US dollars, but incredibly successful and, you know, very, very warmly embraced by the VC market. They are primarily a drug discovery company at this stage. So their real expertise is creating new drugs. They don't have a commercial presence. They don't have any commercial products on sale. They have one drug in human trials apart from this one, which is doing great. But fundamentally, they're a bit more of a science shop, if I can put it that way. And, you know, I think part of the art of drug development for companies like all of ours is really understanding what you're good at. Some companies are fantastically good commercial organizations, like Pfizer, for instance. They don't discover many drugs. Some companies are brilliant scientists that can kind of create new medicines, but they're not great at running the clinical trials and thinking about the commercial angle. And then some companies are in the middle and they're good at moving the drug from the lab to the market. And to be honest, that's what we would like Percheron to be. We think that's actually the sweet spot for our company. So I think there's a real kind of synergy between the companies. Hummingbird has said publicly that they're pointing their business in a few different directions. Their lead program, HMBD-001, is going gangbusters, so they're really very focused on that at the moment. They also have some very, very interesting new technologies that are coming out of the lab, which they're really prioritizing, and I think their VC investors are particularly excited about. So I think it's left this drug, 002, in a certain sense, orphaned by their emerging strategic direction. And that, by the way, happens all the time in drug development. We often see companies fundamentally discover more drugs than they have bandwidth to develop. And in that case, they very often partner them with other companies. And so there are many companies like ours that really build very, very prosperous businesses out of drug candidates that just weren't quite a strategic fit for their parent company. I've been involved in a few such stories myself. And so I think it was really just where they are in their evolution as a company, fundamentally.
Do you know how much they spent to date?
We don't know exactly how much they've spent to date, and it's difficult to come to an exact figure because some of the early work that was done on this drug serviced multiple drug candidates, if I can put it that way. So it's hard to allocate the cost to precisely. But what I would say is that the work that's been done, you know, for us to replicate it from square one, or for any other company to get to this stage, would be an undertaking in the, you know, several tens of millions of dollars. And again, we're talking US dollars. I think that's exactly right. We've saved ourselves perhaps $20-something million and probably about 7 years of work. So that is exactly the value proposition for the company. And if I can put it this way, we've cut out a lot of the less exciting parts. You know, as I say, clinical proof of concept is where the action happens for a drug development company. When you take a drug that is just entering human trials, if you partner it with another company, if you're lucky, you get back in the economics what you've spent on developing it. So you break even, basically. But if you partner a drug after clinical proof of concept, you typically get back about 10 times what you've spent on it. So really the economic value is all added in the human trials that show the drug to be efficacious. That's where the rubber hits the road. And as I say, that is now where we've positioned Percheron. That's the journey that's ahead of us over the next couple of years. And that's what we're excited to be focused on. So ladies and gentlemen, let's adjourn, and it's been a real pleasure to talk through the story and to share an update with you, and look, lots more to talk about over the months ahead. Thank you.